Expanding Mind with Erik Davis and Maja Daoust. Thursdays at 2 p.m. Eastern Time on the Progressive Radio Network.
I'm your host, Erik Davis, and we will continue our explorations of the cultures of consciousness. One of the few things that's amusing about this presidential campaign season, which is so tiresome and disheartening in so many ways, is the spectacle of watching a Mormon move through the maelstrom of American religious sensibility and political sensibility to achieve such a high degree of status and possibility. You know, it's when JFK was running for president in the late 50s, people thought a Catholic couldn't be elected because of the way that Catholics had been critiqued, enormous amount of prejudice, conspiracies. You know, sometimes they were basically associated with devil worshippers in the minds of certain kinds of crazy Protestants. And then he becomes a president. You know, in retrospect, it's like a Catholic, big deal. But 10 years ago, if you'd asked me, I would say, no way would you get a Mormon as the likely Republican presidential candidate, and partly because the makeup of the a large swath of American Protestant Christianity is pretty strongly opposed to Mormonism, at least some of its ideas. It looks kind of heretical, and if you look close at Mormonism, there's some really oddball things in it from a conventional Christian perspective. And what this has done for me, or made me think about, is just how kind of pervasive but also surprising and multidimensional American Christianity is. And if you're not a Christian and you live on the coast, it's very easy to forget what a variegated landscape American Christianity is, especially because certain voices are so strongly in the media, in politics, and also in popular culture that it's very easy, even if you're a student of religion and American religion like myself, it's very easy to kind of settle on a very one-dimensional picture of what is, one of the most really significant aspects of American identity in a lot of ways. And so today I'm very happy we're going to be talking with Brad Pickens, who I met at a wonderful conference on religion and literature that was about homecoming, and he gave a wonderful paper and talked about his very interesting background and his own family, and we'll be talking about that, and has some very interesting ideas about American Christianity. And so we'll be getting to that, but right now I'll bring on our co-host, Maja Daoust. Maja, how you doing?
I'm good, Erik. How are you?
I'm pretty good. So you saw that Robert Anton Wilson thing on Boing Boing?
I did, yeah. I'm a big Raw fan, and I know we were both asked to contribute. And I gotta say, I was reading yours, and it just really lit up my appreciation for your way with words. I really enjoyed what you had to say and thought it was very well written.
Well, I thought the whole series was a really great idea. I'm really glad they did that.
Yeah, there was tons of good
these
stuff.
Figures they go away. It's like they're very significant, but if they're not drummed into your brain through the media or school, even these figures that are really significant can kind of drop away with the generation. I mean, I was reading the comments section of on Boing Boing, and it was like people were like, well, I actually never read him. What should I read? And and you can kind of see the way that people are starting to go, okay, these are the ones you got to read, and it becomes a canon, which is important actually, especially for the 60s, 70s stuff, which the mainstream isn't going to give you that canon. So it's like you have to like create a sense of like, okay, if you're going to read Leary, read this one. If you're going to read Robert Anton Wilson, read this one.
It's true. It's kind of like Jesus too. I mean, talking about Christianity. I mean, everyone will probably get really mad that I just compared Robert Anton Wilson to Jesus, but he's probably laughing about it. But Jesus is the same way. Only certain teachings of his are kind of promulgated, and then a lot of the kind of more mystic and arguably beautiful poetic ones get a little shoved into obscurity. So keeping those strains alive is really important.
Well, that's where the idea of the canon comes from, and it's some people want to pretend that there isn't one, and that it's always a way of saying of forcing a certain kind of opinion about the world on people by sort of saying this is what the important texts are, and these are the unimportant texts are, but at the same time, it's sort of inevitable, and I think sometimes has to be embraced.
Yes.
But with that, we'll invite Brad onto the show. Brad, thanks so much for joining us here on Expanding Mind.
Yes, well, thank you for having me on.
Well, as I said, I heard a lot of really interesting talks at that conference, and I met a lot of cool folks, but I was just so interested, in your story. And I know you have a lot of really interesting scholarly ideas, your own work on the particular sect that you grew up in and such. But for me, I'd love to start out with just a little bit about that. Tell me a little bit about the Farmhouse Mission and the land it's on, and your own kind of experience growing up in a rooted way that's very rare for people of our generation. I mean, you're probably younger than me, and I very rarely meet people who have that kind of connection to a land and a place and a particular cultural tradition in America. So I would love to start off that way.
Yeah, well, that's something I, certainly reflect on quite a bit. My background, I grew up on my family farm in southern Indiana with my parents and my sister. And the kind of odd thing about that is, the farm has been in the family continuously since the early 1800s, before Indiana was a state. My family's lived there, and so now we're 7 generations in. And I went away to college after high school and moved back to live in the house that my grandfather and his dad built, during the Depression. We grew up, at this little church just down the road from us. That we've just always been there, and so everything about my life, I guess for good or ill, kind of relates back to those two places. To the church and to the land, to the idea of family and the idea of continuity in place. And those are just the defining parts of my life.
Tell me a little bit about the church. How old is the actual building?
The actual building is actually only about 50 years old, but the church itself was established in 1820 by a guy who kind of founded the denomination that I'm part of. He was sort of coming through Indiana on one of his little mission trips, and he just left this string of churches in his wake. And it makes it kind of an odd church because it's at 1820, it's one of the oldest churches in this denomination. And it's just, it's this little country church, but it's been in existence all that time.
So what's the name of the denomination?
The denomination it calls itself a number of names, and it's actually very difficult to name because it's a restorationist sect of Christianity, and they set out in about 1802, the early 1800s, with this idea that they would restore New Testament Christianity on the American frontier. And so part of that restoration was to use Bible words for Bible things. And so they just called themselves Christian Church or Church of Christ or, these very kind of generic sort of names. And so they started out, it was called Union Christian Church, because they wanted everybody to, to come together and kind of believe the same things that they did. And then later on, this church called itself Pinhook, because they had these pegs sticking out of the walls that you'd hang your coats on as you came in. And now it's called Syri Christian Church. It's spelled Syria, like the country, but they pronounce it Syri.
And how would you compare that to like other kind of groups? Would you say it's kind of more Quakery, or what about it makes it like restorative in terms of going back to like you mean before the Catholic Church, or?
Yes, yeah. There's a lot of, America really had a lot of restorationist churches that grew up, and the Mormons were one, Jehovah's Witness, the Seventh-day Adventists. All of those had kind of, restorative ideals. These guys were really looking at specifically at the first century. Once we got out of the first century, they said, well, the church kind of went off the rails and got into the realm of apostasy and things like that. And so they really focused narrowly on restoring the form of the first century church. They wanted it to have the same kind of government, the same kind of beliefs, the same kind of doctrine. And so what they wound up with was a really kind of a rigid doctrinal system that was trying to read the New Testament just very, very closely in order to find, what they called a blueprint for the church for all time. And so that created some really interesting kind of problems and maybe some potential for the church, but probably more problems than potential, as it developed.
One of the interesting things about your story is that you grew up in this environment, a very traditional environment. You grew up in this denomination, which had its own, as you point out, its own rigidity, as well as powerful emotional experiences and a strong sense of the gospel. And then you go away to school and you study religion. And that's often a really interesting thing, because I'm in a religious studies program now, so I watch this happen, and there's a lot of people who go into programs. Sometimes they're going in just to continue down the path that they're on. But as they develop more intellectual tools, as they understand history more, as they understand the contingency of things, that things are made up sometimes, that they're taking place within a whole set of other contexts. People often end up getting really complicated relationships to their faith. Sometimes people abandon it. Sometimes people strip it down to sort of just a kind of an ethical core, and they leave aside some of the more intense things that they might have grown up with. Sometimes they reject scholarship as sort of things, and they go back. What was your experience as you came from, a very strong faith experience and it was a strong sense of tradition, as you went to kind of start to bring in those questions?
My experience, I guess, in some ways kind of began before I left even, as far as bringing up questions about what the nature of this faith was. Because part of growing up here, is to be very involved in, youth group at church, and, they had Bible camps and, things like that where you get together with other people. But part of my experience then was being around, other kids, that had this really, committed sort of focus on, on this Christian life stuff. And then things would happen and they'd sort of drift away, and it was like, that religious experience never happened or didn't exist. And so, when I left here from high school, I went to one of the denominational Bible colleges because I thought, well, I want to start a ministry. I want to do something, that will keep people in the faith, after, we get out of high school. And the experience there was such that the kind of questions that I had and the kind of issues I felt needed to be addressed, simply weren't. And so by the time I was done with that first undergraduate program, I realized I wasn't in any sort of shape at all, to go out into ministry to take on a church, and which is kind of the typical thing in this, in this group. I mean, you go to school for 4 years, you get your Bible college degree, and then they sort of throw you out there, to be a minister, to tell, people 3 times your age how to live a Christian life, and I just found that just so sort of off-putting. And there were so many places where, just observing reality. I mean, seeing life and other forms of thought and things like that, didn't match up with what the doctrine of the church had to offer.
What was it in the religion, or in your own sense of religious experience, or your own powerful convictions that emerged from those experiences? What was it that you felt was sort of missing? Like, what was that point where you're like, these people are this is going in a different direction than what I'm kind of called to do?
The way I would put that now, and I wouldn't have phrased it like this then, but looking at it now, I mean, the thing that was missing was something that was, was actually deeply spiritual in character, and that was kind of a generational thing, like in the church that I grew up in, because like the older generation, the one just below them, they read their Bible and they understood it. It was part of the fabric of their lives. And so they had just this deeply, religious, this deeply spiritual character that sort of permeated everything. But then as you kind of got younger and younger, you started to have more and more things where, the church was trying to cater to us. And so it wasn't that the church was offering us something, spiritual in nature, but the church was offering us, an experience. It was saying, here's, music that's very similar to what's offered on, like a secular radio station or something. And this is worth listening to. And so it was kind of it was that sort of thing. And it was the creation of this alternative quasi-Christian culture that surrounded us. And in time, it was just the dissatisfaction of living in something that was so obviously manufactured, and so obviously not part of something that was really, deeply spiritual, but it was just part of marketing a faith.
Right. Well, let me. I want to get to some of that stuff later because it's really interesting stuff. But I want to focus in on one thing here. There's a lot of people in America now who describe, if they're asked about their belief, they'll say that they're spiritual and not religious. And it's actually remarkable how much that phrase has grown as a kind of self-identification. I think there was, I don't remember who made the survey, but there was like, an official survey of religion that was quite widespread within the last year or so, and they found that particularly among younger people that self-identification is really growing, and I'm sure many people listening to this show probably put themselves somewhere in that zone. And so coming from a very religious perspective, where it's very clearly you're in a denomination, you're in a belief structure, when you talk about what is spiritual, what do you mean?
Primarily something that gives some kind of contact with God, with the divine. That would be the main referent. And I think that religion can both hamper that, which I think is, the experience, as you mentioned, of a lot of people. But it can also encourage it and sort of give it a little bit of structure, to find God, to find divinity, to encounter that in the everyday life. And it's an odd thing because, it seems to me that doesn't always happen, like in one given denomination or in one given, religious background. But you can find like little pockets of that, just about everywhere on both sides.
Well, and the irony of that is that the majority of religions actually exclude spirituality in the sense that they kind of teach you can't have a personal experience or relationship with, God. You have to go through some kind of mediator, like a priest, and actually it's heretical in a lot of religions to kind of claim that you have even had that. So, it's what you're saying is ironic just in the sense that sadly, many religions kind of frown on personal spirituality.
Right, and that was very much, it's a part of the, kind of the denominational perspective, that I grew up with.
Right.
You had the Bible, and the Bible was there to tell you everything. And so I remember, like, when I graduated from high school, these very kind, people would give you these little books, where to look in the Bible when you're angry and when you're sad, when you feel good. And, it's like these isolated verses that are supposed to, to fix whatever's wrong or to encourage whatever's going right. And there's something about that seems so unreal, because you actually have like a problem. Something in your life that is disordered. And you've got like this one random verse out of this gigantic, thick book that on its own influence is just supposed to somehow magically fix that.
Yeah, it's almost like a kind of pill-popping approach to Scripture. But one of the ironies here, and I think this runs, throughout Protestant Christianity, is that there's lots of denominations, lots of sects begin with this passionate desire to recover the original moment of Christianity before it's even called Christianity. The first, his ministry and the first few generations that followed him. The first 100 years. The world represented by the Gospels and by Acts and by the world that the letters that fill up the rest of the New Testament were about, that world. So it's like we want to strip away all that history has done to destroy the message and to create apostasy and create institutions and create the Catholic Church and all of that, and let's go back to that original moment because it's fresh, because the Spirit is alive, because that sort of Pentecostal eruption of intensity is available. So you see that like in Pentecostalism, although they do it in a very different kind of way. It's like that return to that moment. And yet, at the same time, there's this other side that you're also describing where going back to that moment is also about turning the text into this kind of blueprint, like this sort of literalistic map where you organize all of the ambiguity and confusion and paradox and tragic, bittersweet contradiction of life along lines which are clarified in a way that seems almost the opposite. It's almost the opposite in a way, because it seems like there's something about that original moment that's obviously going to be more than doctrine. So it's a funny mix, and it's, I think, a lot of the part of what it always attracts and kind of repels me from a lot of American Protestantism is precisely that there's this real sense of intensity and of openness to that kind of the sort of dynamics, the immediacy of the God moment, of the gospel arena, of that theater, and at the same time there's this desire to kind of hammer it into doctrine that is, that then you can use as a way to rule your life and rule other people and judge and all that kind of thing. I mean, that's a little too simplistic, but do you see the kind of the paradox there that I'm talking about?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's all about sort of the wielding of power and the ability to kind of control that moment. And and that's one of the things I think is interesting. Like, as you look back at, sort of these original moments in, say in Christianity or, or some other, religious background, there had to have been something sort of spontaneous and surprising about that.
Exactly.
And in the process of making that into something that's doctrinally driven, that's where everything is set and ordered and so on and so forth, it removes that, and it kind of takes away the possibility of something happening today, because whatever encounter I have with God today, it has to be something that's grounded in today. It can refer back maybe to what happened 2,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, whenever, but it's still got to be a present reality.
Well, and that's a really important point, I think. And you'll look at a lot of the kind of like reformist religions, and they are trying to put it into modern times, but then they'll do things like, like Erik said, like they're trying to get back to that original pure form of the thing, but I mean they're doing it from like maybe some not so good English translation that is like removed from the language and the culture and the history of the people. And like, if you want to get into Christianity like origins, you go to like the Coptic Church, you go to Egypt, right? You go to like where it started. But do you think it's possible through like experience of using these maybe not so correct translations of the actual doctrine to have that kind of like resurrection in a modern moment, in like a free moment in a time of now, removed from all history and culture, maybe everything that went into it? I mean, I guess that's kind of what you're saying, right? That we can just like in a moment today have that experience. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I think it's true to have and to sort of recover, those spiritual realities. I think the idea that you could go back in time somehow and recreate, the ethos, the culture, and all that stuff to some kind of, to some kind of high degree is really kind of a utopian fantasy, I mean, very often it's trying to create something that probably didn't exist in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Because, as you noted, like you're reading these texts, completely divorced from, the cultural context in which they were written. You're reading them, in translation usually. You're reading them with, we read those things with our own blinders on and whatnot. And so a recovery of something that happened then, it seems very, very difficult. But then a creation of some kind of present reality that that gets to that same type of spirituality or that same type of contact with the divine. I mean, that seems like something that could have the possibility of life.
Yeah, well, I want to pick up on that theme exactly and talk about some of what you do at the Farmhouse Mission and how you see that particular possibility emerging today. But we got to take a break here. You're listening to Erik Davis and Maja Daou on Expanding Mind. We're talking with Brad Pickens, and we'll be right back after these messages.
Welcome back to Expanding Mind on the Progressive Radio Network. I'm Maja Daou, and we're here with Erik Davis, speaking with Brad Pickens about trying to get Jesus back to life. Before the break, this is, to me, like kind of my favorite thing to talk about with religion and spirituality, which is how do you live it? And, I mean, honestly, I'm as big a fan of getting into the research and the nitty-gritty as anyone, but I think the truth of any religious idea or doctrine is in how can you live it in your life? How can you bring it into you, into now? So, I mean, I like Erik, I'm really interested in finding out, like, how through your life on the farm and through your own personal experience, how did you kind of find those Bible truths? And, I mean, I guess that's kind of a big question, but if you can, like, maybe share a single experience you had that really kind of, like, where you felt it in your heart as you were alive.
I think, I mean, at this point, I'm really interested in having that spiritual truth as part of the everyday lived reality, because I think that we have a tendency to try to isolate spiritual moments in time. You go to church, you go to the temple, you go to the mosque, you go, to Burning Man, whatever it is. And there's something there that this is the time for spiritual reality and the lived presence of God. And then you go home and you've got your job or your family or, whatever it is that sort of is isolated from that spiritual life. And what I'm particularly interested in is how I make, every day, how I make each action a part of the spiritual reality. So a lot of what we're doing, as you say, I work, I guess we have a nonprofit organization that we operate here on the farm, that's called the Farmhouse Mission. And the farmhouse is based on, these ideas of monastic spirituality, where the day is kind of, sort of ordered by these moments of prayer, that then guide and kind of control the work a little, what we're thinking about and how we're doing it. And so the idea is that, that what we do in prayer, what we do in reading the Bible, then becomes part of what we're doing when, we're working in the workshop or out in the garden or, or something like that. And that's very much been the thing that we've been exploring here, just in our life.
Well, that's something that when I first kind of started researching the Bible, I was living with a Hasidic Jew, and one thing I noticed was they would put prayer into every mundane activity they did, whether it was like, going to the bathroom. Like I would hear him saying these prayers after going to the bathroom. I was like, what are you doing? He's like, well, we have to put God into everything, and he'd be brushing his teeth, and they say a prayer. You wash your hands, you say a prayer. And it's like that concept of injecting God into every stupid, mundane thing you do is kind of like an important part of it.
Yeah, that's right. And it kind of, and it keeps everything sort of going a little bit. It keeps everything balanced, I mean, by way of example, I see my wife every day, and before she goes to work, I tell her I love her and I kiss her on the cheek, and that's okay. But then there's sometimes more than others that's really meaningful and important, and it's not that it isn't there the other times, but it's sort of in the process of doing it, in the habit of doing it, it allows it to be meaningful at all times in some way.
Well, because part of what you're saying there is it's really about time, and you're right that there is a tendency and an excessive emphasis on moments, peak experiences in American religiosity, both in terms of the New Age, the spiritual but not religious people, where you're always seeking for that experience, and it's like the experience is going to give you what you want, and then it's going to maybe help guide your life, or at least make you feel full, or that it'll answer your perpetual seeking. Or increasingly in conservative Christianity, for example, where, as you say, there's this kind of emphasis on like the music playing, where you have that moment of binding, or we see some services where they're clearly creating this charismatic moment of intensity that takes place in a very specific thing. And there's some wonderful stuff about that approach, the sort of spiritual experience emphasis, but it can go too far. And I think part of what happens is that, like you say, they become these like very isolated moments in time that inevitably fail, and then you're left with like, well, now what do I do? Do I go try to repeat and get more of those? Do I give myself over to despair because actually things haven't really changed? Or is there a way to kind of, in a way, sort of draw those out through time rather than intensifying them in some moment, of almost timelessness? So it's like that the everydayness becomes a place for that in a way sets up those kinds of experiences, except that they reverberate through your whole day or your whole habit, like the same gesture that you make for your wife. There is that one day where it's not only that you had, where it was extra special, there was some sense of the meaningfulness of being together, but also that all those other moments that were mundane are kind of enlivened in a way.
Right. Yeah, they're encapsulated by that,
So how do you help encourage? How does the Farmhouse Mission help develop that kind of approach? Is it by having a kind of a monastic structure for the day in terms of bringing Scripture and reading into the other activities?
Yeah, very much. I mean, we have groups and individuals, people that have come out here, really from all over the world, and regardless of who the group is or who the people are, what's going on, but the entire day is structured around and through prayer. It's something that happens corporately with whoever happens to be there, and around. We'll gather for prayer, and we follow a liturgy for that, and it's also something that happens individually, because there's time that's taken apart for someone to go out in the woods and sit by the pond and sort of reflect and meditate on the just whatever needs to be meditated on. And kind of the idea is through that, and we try not to get a lot fancier than that, because the idea is that we want to sort of introduce some ideas and habits and things that people can take back and actually do, when they go back to their to their jobs, to their everyday life, and things of that nature. And one of the things, a lot of the religious circles that that I've run in, and what I grew up with, there was this idea that you go to a week at church camp, or you go to to some kind of seminar, some kind of conference, and you come home and you say, man, that was a life-changing experience, And well, the thing of it is, after about 3 or 4 life-changing experiences, it starts to ring a little false, And so, like, we kind of set out, when we started, we said we don't want anybody to come here and say, man, that changed my life. Like, we want somebody to come here and have something that's both tangible and points them to God, that can be integrated in what they're already doing and in what's already happening. Just from the standpoint that I've seen people have their lives changed. I mean, I've been through these revivals and stuff like that, and at the end of it, I've got to kind of say, well, that didn't take, And so the option is to keep, perpetuating that, trying it again and trying, I think, somebody mentioned a minute ago, keep chasing that experience, this thing that happened in the past.
Well, and I think part of the key to that, really, and what you're saying, is the difference between internal and external. I think when people witness these miracles or see these things kind of happen outside themselves, it can have this, like you say, life-changing experience, because it kind of stirs their faith or belief, But then those are still very abstract things, and they're not integrating into their life. And I think kind of the kicker for what you're talking about is when they have it happen from the inside out, because then it's actually part of them and they can make it part of their lives. I mean, I think you kind of have to have a combo, because you almost have to see something outside yourself so you can even see that that's possible. But I think you're talking about, those simple kind of things where you can show them how to get there from their inside really makes a big difference.
Yeah, and I think that's actually right. And maybe the way to say it is, I don't want to be greedy for those kind of moments. These really deeply spiritual things. That's an offering of grace, rather than something maybe that I can demand.
It's so funny to hearing you talk about it this way, because it's we usually don't think of serious Christians and New Age mystical types in the same kind of structure, but in a way what you're describing applies so equally to both groups, and I've seen it in myself. I mean, one of the things about growing up as a sort of self-identified seeker, where I was aware that I was roving through all of these different practices and religious traditions and texts and groups and experiences, and there was this sort of sense of a search for epiphany, and then I have epiphanies, and then I'd be like, well, now what? And it's okay, here we go. And then as I get older and I see more and more people who get kind of stuck in that, and and then sort of use that as a way to avoid kind of, I guess I would call it getting down to brass tacks, which may be just some form of like a boring idea of maturity, but but in any case has actually made the question of where Spirit speaks and where where these moments are to be much subtler and richer in my own life, and I can see backwards how I also was very much fetishizing these moments of intensity. And then the thing that we're not talking about that you alluded to earlier very briefly is how well that attitude plugs into contemporary commercial culture, which is always wanting to sell you an experience. And we think of this experience idea as some kind of esoteric thing or some kind of like the most important part of life, but it's like that's what we see all over the place with how media works, with how how culture is bought and sold, what people are seeking for when they have their leisure time. It's very deeply interfused with that kind of American sensibility, and it sounded like that was part of what you have been responding to is your sense of the way Christianity has been reproducing itself lately in terms of in consumerism in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's a lot of my academic work and a lot of the stuff that I end up reflecting on now. It has to do with the commodification of Christianity. And so, like
what's a good example of that? Like what would you be responding to?
A number of things. What happens around here, I mean, probably the most, in one sense, the most obvious thing for me is what happens in, you go into these Christian bookstores, like these Bible bookstores and stuff like that. And the whole place is full of these materials. And some of it's fine, good stuff and whatever. But a lot of it is really kind of there to make you feel inadequate. You're not doing a good enough job as a Christian. I mean, you're failing at changing the culture. You're failing at, how you act as a parent. You're failing at how you act as a husband or an employer or, as a man. I mean, as a woman, you're not doing it correctly. And so once they sort of get into you that way, with the idea that there's some kind of Christian reality out there that you're not actually participating in. And then they've got like shelf after shelf after shelf of books that will tell you how to participate in that. And the way to do it is to keep buying the books, I mean,
it's kind of like Scientology.
It could be. It kind of is. They set it up to do that. And so what happens is, and I can see this really clearly now, like when I left to go to college, there's some Bible study out that everybody had to do in order to be a good Christian. And then I came back from college and everyone was saying, "Hey, have you done this, this other Bible study? You really should do it. It'll help you be a great Christian." And then 3 years later, this other study came along. And so it's like this cyclical thing that was constantly, sort of saying the same thing, sort of talking about and promoting this generically American form of Christianity. And it never changes. And that's one of the things I think is really interesting. Is how the church operates or I should say certain segments of the church operate, to kind of promote these books and studies and things like that really tend to reflect the dominant values of American culture.
Well, and it's kind of sad because if you do compare it to like Scientology or other cults, I mean, they're acting in the same way that propagandist mind control cults work. I mean, they use fear, they use guilt, they use threats, and they kind of channel the material to a specific area. I mean, I remember even having a conversation with a fellow who was, a fundamentalist Christian, and I told him how many different things I read, and his response was, how do you know what to believe by reading such a diverse amount of, like, the idea of reading other things other than what he was presented with in his Christian bookstore was actually a threat to his faith and kind of his religion. So they do, I think it's a little more insidious than just consumerism, because they're trying to direct the information so specifically, so as to not include any other variants.
Yeah, well, and I think that's what's interesting. I mean, because you're right, because really what's going on is they're working to kind of construct this alternate form of reality.
Yeah.
And it happens in a really, kind of in a hierarchical way, because you've got all these authority figures. It's leaders in a given denomination. You've got some people that sort of transcend denominations, and they're just, Pat Robertson kind of guys, or, Rick Warren, something like that. There's just these generic Christian figures that sort of have these broad pronouncements to a variety of people. And that's something that happens on a populist level. But then there's another layer to it that's sort of undergirded by all these little, colleges and publishing houses and things like that. And when you get enough people, sort of writing and thinking and moving in a certain direction, you've suddenly got like a whole level of scholarship, but a really odd scholarship. It's a really particular one, and it's the creation of, this particular kind of Christian reality that doesn't necessarily, relate back to, the historic positions of the church, say, or, something like that. It's just something that's of the moment, and it's a very American phenomenon.
Yeah, and it's happening, more intensification now, because it's very easy to live in self-confirming media bubbles, and in a way that's one of the major problems that we look at in terms of how do we, create a larger sense of either a public space of possible consensus or at least communication, as well as a religious one, is that it's easier and easier to just sort of surround yourself with lots of data that reinforce whatever your particular reality is. And that reality construction model, which is funny, we talked about Robert Anton Wilson at the beginning, and he talked about, quite prophetically, reality tunnels, and he used to talk about how it was really good to subscribe to magazines that were opposite your opinions, just to kind of break up everybody's tendency to kind of go that way. But with the media culture being the way it is, it's just much easier to kind of go that way. And so it's I think it is a very American thing, but it's also something that I think we're kind of we're facing on a reality level as well. Whereas for me, part of what a religion and spirituality is about are those points where your reality breaks down, where you don't know, where it's unclear, where you have to go by gut, where you have to trust, where you don't know who the other is, you don't know what the other's truth is, and those are the places where the action happens. But the whole relationship to Christianity, American Christianity to media and media culture and popular culture has changed so extraordinarily. I mean, in the 50s, 60s, into the 70s, a lot of really, strong, Bible-thumping Christians looked at popular culture as the enemy. Because in some ways, it was. It was the counterculture, and it was rock and roll and sex, drugs, and all that stuff. And then at some point, it starts kind of in the 80s, and it really flowers in the 1990s. You see this total transformation where now everything in popular culture becomes sort of mirrored with this analog, not everything, but almost everything gets mirrored with this analog that's sort of branded Christian. So we have Christian bikers and Christian surfers and Christian metal bands and and it's like the same thing but not the same thing. And some of it's really interesting, but sometimes, and I don't know, I find myself sort of nostalgic for a more differentiated sense of Christian culture, because it seemed to keep a space open for something other than this kind of commercial reality, this kind of, commercial identity where you buy and sell your identity, where you kind of just reconfirm that space. And I don't know if this is too simplistic a reading, but it seemed to resonate with some of the things that you were talking about.
No, I think that's right. Because the irony of all that is that it actually functions to completely undercut what these Christians are really really trying to point to. I mean, theoretically, they're trying to say that what is here and now, it's not the be all and end all. We want to point to something that's transcendent. We want to point beyond ourselves. But what they're doing is they're trying to do that by imitating the culture and by manufacturing things that that you can't tell the difference from one to the next. And that was a big thing, growing up, as you had to listen to Christian music, And so you'd go in these, in these bookstores and they'd have these lists, if you like, if you like REM, then why don't you try listening to this group? And if you like, they had a response for everything. And so the idea was that in order to participate in this, in this religious community, you didn't actually have to give anything up. You didn't have to modify your behaviors in any way. You didn't have to, to change anything in order to, to seek God. You could keep doing what you're doing. You're just changing the wallpaper,
Well, and that I think is so important, because part of the having like a true mystic spiritual experience of, say Jesus, like you're talking about, is not about separation, right? Separation is what the Bible talks about, how we remove God from ourselves. That's in the story of Adam and Eve. So why would you have to separate, as if some aspect of your life did not include God or was removed from that you have to pluck them out and push them off somewhere else? That kind of separatism, I think, almost precludes being able to have the kind of experiences that you're talking about that are kind of true and felt and in your everyday life.
I think there's phases. I think that's the problem. We get into a binary. I think there's some points in anybody's life, you don't even have to think about it in terms of spirituality, but even just in terms of maturity, where there are some points that it's important to look at the world as a trap, and that your desires and your experiences are illusions in some ways. But there are also points where those same things become the site of affirmation, and it's hard to know when is appropriate. Sometimes you gotta pull away. You gotta have a sense that there's something outside the world in the negative sense. But it's precisely by doing that you come back to a place where you can really affirm the world. And so I think it's real hard to kind of make a blanket side on either way. But it does seem to me that really odd that a lot of that Christian culture, it's like everything's the same, except all you have to do is kind of tag it with Jesus. It's like you put a little stamp at the end, or a little hashtag, on your thing, and you're like, that's it. That's all you got to do. Now you're done. Now we've got you on our side. The gospel, the evangelical desire has been satisfied, and we move on. So it's really great to see the stuff that you're working on, Brad. I find it very inspiring, and we got to wrap it up here. So good luck with the Farmhouse Mission, and thanks so much for being on Expanding Minds.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
All right, from me and Maja, keep your minds open.